I don't know how coherent my response will be after 5 days of marking student essays, but I'll do my best. I suppose one of the main things that strikes me about the presentations today, about the kind of research that people are talking about and the projects they've been doing, and also about the MEDIVA project, is that it signals a move away from textual analysis of journalistic text towards dialogue with journalists, interviews with journalists, and also with audiences, with consumers of media, which I think is really welcome, and I think is probably the only way that this topic is going to actually be addressed by academia in any kind of meaningful way. So I think that was a first and really welcome observation about the talks today. And the same kinds of issues, I suppose, come up over and over in a lot of these this research, which I think can probably be summed up with issues within journalistic cultures, and how does one intervene within journalistic cultures and how they become replicated. And training and education would seem to me to be a really core issue there, and Verica highlighted that in very concrete terms. This is how this needs to be addressed. Because I see, particularly, teaching journalism students a kind of enduring belief in neutrality, objectivity, and very often I think this can easily be couched underneath this adherence to professionalism. And I think professionalism has become quite an elastic concept that hides all kinds of, I suppose, values and codes, professional codes that don't really fit very well in a postmodern world. And I think there's some resistance maybe there. I don't want to talk too much about the internal politics of teaching subjects such as media and interculturalism to journalism students here in DCU, but that there are times when such subjects are seen as not particularly important to those students' training. And I think therein probably lies the first major obstacle in this issue, is at third level. Verica talked about inclusive journalism, which I thought is a really interesting concept, and I think this is probably this kind of research is the first step into investigating the possibilities for that. Certainly my own experience of doing any kind of research that involved going out and talking to editors and talking to journalists, it's not even a case necessarily, I think, of any kind of unwillingness. There's just generally sometimes an unawareness or a very strict way of putting together news. So we won't do a story. If you remember, Pascal, the project that you were PI on Europe and coverage of European identity and European issues. And I worked as a research assistant on that, and going out and talking to editors is very interesting. What would you cover a story on this? No, it doesn't have an Irish hook. It's got to have an Irish interest. What about Eastern Europe? No, we're not really interested in that. It's only the EU that people are interested in because that relates to Ireland, and that relates to how much money we're going to get, or so there are very strict kind of codes. So I think all of this work really addresses those kind of very practical issues, which I found really refreshing as opposed to the more abstract analysis of text, which is also important, but obviously is not the only thing that's going on. And I do notice that, as I say, with students, that kind of belief in neutrality still, that Western media values are somehow objective values. And, talking about responses to the Danish cartoon affair, for example, after my students have read Tariq Madood's response to that, they have a completely different take on it. And it's like, wow, I never thought of it like that. I find that really interesting, that kind of exposure to different ideas, that whiteness is invisible to them in the media. And basically we spend the whole module making it visible. And that's quite a challenge sometimes. I really enjoyed the Miria's talk on consumption, I thought that was hugely important, and maybe something that also more conventional journalists don't think about an awful lot, is how media are actually consumed, and the kind of stream of media, particularly young people, and their concept of news. You know, they're getting news from Facebook is news. I get a lot of my news from Facebook. That's how I keep up with what's going on, because other people do the trawling around for me in many ways. And also the whole kind of reality TV as news. I thought it was really interesting that television was so prominent among your respondents as well. So it makes you think of consumption as really important as well. And also, these conflicting ideas that came up in your research, and then in Ciaran's research about the kind of, the internet of one, which is narrowing down one's worldview, and then, the kind of more proactive use of the internet, which is bringing people into kind of more diverse or alternative views. So there's very interesting, potentially contradictory frameworks or ideas going on there, which I haven't fully got my head around yet, because they're just so big, I think. I thought the point you made, Neil, about Ted Glaser's comment about, a more ethnically diverse newsroom doesn't necessarily lead to more ethnically diverse output or content was, it's kind of shocking in a way, but I think to a large extent, Heike's research addresses that. There's so many complex processes going on there. That very often, I suppose, there's so much tokenism. We see the optics of liberal multiculturalism at work. We see kind of forms of ventriloquism. But I suppose we also see people feeling that they also need to, again, conform to certain cultures in order to do well within their jobs, and marking oneself out as a kind of tokenistic journalist who always writes about ethnic issues is also hugely problematic as well. It's another form of marginalization. So, the question of visibility and invisibility presents really tricky issues there, I think. I suppose we haven't touched, or nobody seems to really have touched on the significance of commercial media, commercial television versus public service broadcasting, and I presume there would be interesting comparisons there. At least one would hope that there might be some differences there in terms of employment and output. I mean, I think of an example, I don't know if anybody saw the documentary My Big Fat Gypsy Wedding, and how RTE on the Late Late Show, there was a kind of public sphere response to that by members of the Irish travelling community who came on. It was actually very heartening how they responded to what they perceived as their misrepresentation in this documentary. And to me, it highlights the enduring importance of public service broadcasting as television, particularly reality TV, becomes more sensationalist around questions of ethnicity. I'm thinking also of documentaries, or it is a documentary reality TV series like All American Muslim. I don't know if anybody has seen this. I had 2 excellent student essays on it this semester. I haven't actually seen it, but it sounds like a really fascinating show. But again, it's very much dependent on this notion of assimilation and Muslims being patriotic Americans. So it's a very kind of complex discourse going on there. So I suppose, a lot of these questions come down to, whether these are real voices that are telling real stories, or whether it's the kind of tokenism that Heike mentions. And I think that's an important point. And finally, I can't remember who raised this point, but in terms of content, what kind of diversity are we talking about? I think that's a question that we need to come back to again and again. What is actually meant by diversity? Is it just visibility or recognition? Going back to the case of the Polish woman Magda that Patrick cited in the Irish media yesterday. It's a really obvious case of racialization of race or ethnicity or religion being over-determined. And I think we have these kind of 2 trends, either these these categories are hugely over-determined, or they're under-determined generally. And you know what was interesting about the Magda case and the apology was that a lot of it focused on the issue of mistranslation, not on the fact that the whole story was based on her ethnicity and her right to be here. And she's a Polish woman. So, you know, this is, you could do thousands of stories every day about people who are on the dole and sleep in till midday. You know, if they're Irish, why does this story have any resonance if this woman is a citizen? And yes, yet it does. So, you know, the racialization in that story is the issue, and yet a lot of the focus has been put on the mistranslation. That is, you know, and again, I think this highlights the whole question, the response of journalists, which is, oh, you know, it's professionalism and it was a mistranslation, not we racialized this story. You know, so I think there's just a disconnect there in terms of how that's been understood in many ways. Or on the other hand, you have the kind of underdetermination of ethnicity and religion and belief in the kind of more positive celebratory stories that you see from time to time. You know, again, like the All-American Muslim, the kind of, you know, regular folk stories of assimilation. And those are really, I suppose, you know, we don't see them that often, but they do feature quite often in the Irish Times, for example. So, you know, I think neither of those tendencies within journalism is helpful, because it's always a case of othering. It's always a case of speaking of the other from a dominant position, which is assumed to be neutral. And, you know, just to mention your undercover approach, which I thought was really fascinating, the kind of ethnographic journalism. I suppose we have to be wary. We did have a pretty awful example of that recently in Irish media, where Ian Doherty, a journalist who's renowned for his right-wing views, went undercover and lived with Muslim families for a week. And the results were not particularly enlightening, although I think at the end of the day, he came out of it, you know, for the worst, but that wasn't the intention. And he is very Islamophobic. So, you know, unfortunately, that technique can be abused. It's a very interesting piece of television to watch, though. So I suppose, you know, questions of content then return us to the initial question around training and education, which is, how do you change a culture of Western centricity that's masquerading as professionalism?
Thanks very much, Debbie.